This past week, two unusual stories broke. First, it emerged that Ukraine's State Railroad Company purchased nearly $500,000 of spare parts from Russia. Then a Polish official admitted that his country had purchased coal mined in Ukraine's occupied east from Russia. The coal originated in assets that Russian-backed separatists seized from Ukraine's DTEC company, a representative of the company told us.
After our enterprises got captured by different means, including forcing us to pay taxes on the occupied territories, there was no point in carrying on with the business on those territories and following their unreasonable rules. I wouldn't even call them laws. In the same way, there wasn't any point in transferring the coal from there and paying someone else for it because it used to be ours, and now it belongs to God knows who. So in my opinion, extracting the coal there and using it is out of the question until we regain control over the enterprises and the territories. As far as I know, the Cabinet of Ministers, along with the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, made a series of decisions that oblige carrying out all the duties concerning that territory until the enterprise is returned and until paragraphs 1 and 2 of the Minsk agreements are fulfilled.
Ukraine and Russia are de facto at war. Russia also started a trade war against Ukraine by banning substantial amounts of its exports, mainly in agriculture. Yet Ukraine and Russia still maintain some trade ties. This contradiction represents one of the unusual aspects of their conflict. What is the nature of these ties and how they are developing? We're joined in the studio by economist Volodymyr Vakhitov to find out. Volodymyr, what do you think about these two news about the railway spare parts and about the coal?
I think they're absolutely not surprising because, well, if you think about the railroads in Ukraine and Russia are essentially the same by technology, the same by standards, the same by all technical characteristics. And this is kind of obvious that Ukraine buys those spare parts from Russia because it might be possible that Russia was pretty much the only country which would produce those spare parts. And about coal from DNR, I think this is also not very much surprising. I suppose that DNR is desperately looking for outer markets, and once they have found some market in Poland, and if somebody in Poland decided to buy this coal for cheap, I think this is kind of obvious that those countries started to trade. The cases of that has been found throughout the history of wars many times, dozens of times.
So do you think their cases are not isolated and there are many more similar cases in Ukrainian situation?
Yes, of course, because once we're thinking about trade, the trade is not between countries, the trade is between firms, the trade is between individuals. And not all individuals support the idea that we are at war with Russia. Not all individuals support that all the economic ties should break down, and some individuals would like to see some profits from this conflict. And this is very obvious that once there are some opportunities for the profits, some people would be willing to grab these opportunities.
Do you think that Ukrainian state should react somehow on this to impose sanctions over these particular subjects that are trading?
I think if Ukrainian state could impose some sanctions has already been imposed. It looks like the Ukrainian state doesn't have enough capacity to impose those sanctions. This is number one. Number two, once we have some trade with Russia, we obtain some hard currency in exchange for our goods, right? And this hard currency, this is a substantial part of the Ukrainian GDP. I could be mistaken on the numbers, but I think 3 to 5% of Ukrainian GDP is obtained through the trade with Russia. This is a substantial amount of money, and Ukraine faces an option to forget about this money altogether. But in this case, we are going to have a substantial budget hole. And now the question is, what is the source for the pensions? What are the source for the salaries for the budgetary service? What are the source for the money for the reforms? This could be kind of bearable compromise.
But this is a question that probably has been raised throughout the history, right? So the dilemma, either you gain economic benefit or moral choice that you don't trade with the aggressor. Do you see some similar cases throughout history?
Yes, of course. For example, during the civil war between North and South in the United States, the South was famous for producing cotton. And cotton was the major item of exports from the United States to Britain. Britain was actually willing to obtain this cotton for their manufacturing and for their trade. And they were threatening the North that they will recognize the South as a separate state if the if the trade in cotton is somehow interrupted. So since the North has blocked the southern ports, all the trade with Britain was coming through Boston and through other northern ports, and as a result, there should be some trade between North and South. So even though this trade was not very much recognized and not very much allowed or cherished, still this trade was taking place, and this was a substantial amount. Moreover, the price of cotton in the South was something like 7 times lower than in the North. So just imagine some businessman who would face an opportunity to earn 700%.
But let's come back to Ukrainian-Russian situation. We have graphs that illustrating. We'll be now discussing them, illustrating the trends in Ukrainian and Russian trade. Here are some graphs about exports and imports. But let's look at on trend, because we see in 2012 Russia was the biggest Ukrainian trade partner. Imports 32% and export 26%. And then over the years, the war started in 2014, and over the years we see the declining part, and now we have exports only 10% and imports 13%. How we can explain it? Can we explain it by the situation of war? Can we explain it by Russian trade war against Ukraine, or by other means?
The Russian trade war started somewhere around here. So this was approximately when the first embargo on cheese and agricultural products started.
Sorry to interrupt, was it only against Ukrainian agriculture or against machinery and other goods?
First of all, it was against Ukrainian agriculture and food products, not processed agriculture as well. Later on, against machinery as well, but it looks like Russia first faced some sanctions, and Russia cannot right now openly buy whatever they want from the Western countries, and second, it looks like Russia could not substitute Ukrainian goods with the goods of their own with their own. There are several industries which are critical for Russia, and Russia doesn't have any substitutes as well. So this, for example, could be engines and for the ships and the shipbuilding. This could be some reservoirs. This could be those metal rods which are used in construction. Right now, over the several last years, it looks like the entire construction in Moscow is based on those Ukrainian metal rods.
Is it a legacy of the Soviet economy?
This is a legacy of the Soviet economy, and it was much cheaper to buy this stuff in Ukraine. That is why nobody would care much about producing this in Russia on their own. So they face those opportunities. They face the consequences of their own actions right now as well. And again, there are some holes in the border. There are some holes in the legislation. We do not have the open declared war. We have some kind of conflict, and the conflict is a very vague word. That is why there are still some trade. There are some partnerships going on. There is some trade with Russia. I think this is something which is going to be replaced that Russian markets will be replaced by some other markets for Ukrainian exporters.
Let us come back to this issue, but let me ask my colleagues to come back to the first graphs so that we discuss absolute figures. Is there anything that Russia exports to Ukraine that is irreplaceable for Ukraine?
Right now, it could be. As I said, those parts for the railroads, probably they are irreplaceable. It's hard to tell this about this item by item, but from the volume of trade, it looks like we trade from Russia with the goods which, even though they might be replaceable, they're still cheaper to buy in Russia than elsewhere. For example, both Russia sends some shoes to Ukraine, and Ukraine sells some shoes to Russia. this is not something which is not replaceable, but it looks for some particular market. Some particular shoes could be cheaper here, some particular shoes could be cheaper there. That is why countries trade in the goods which are actually the same. So and this is like the trend in the economic theory as well, so that the countries trade in the goods which are similar, not absolutely different.
Let us look at this graph. We see this in absolute figures. So we can say that, for example, Russian imports from Ukraine 13%, exports 10%. Well, figures rather low, but still in absolute figures, it's quite a big sum of money. 3.6 billion, 5.1 billion. What are the key items that still exist in Ukrainian-Russian trade?
As far as I remember, the imports from Ukraine to Russia, this is first the production of machinery. This is some reservoirs. This is what I said, metal rods, which is armatura, whatever it is. And this is basically something which is produced by machine building and metal producing. The Russia sells to Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, some fertilizers, and fertilizers are key for Ukrainian agriculture, and they are probably replaceable but much more expensive elsewhere. Since Russia has extremely low internal prices for gas, the fertilizers in Russia turns out to be much less expensive than anywhere else. So it's, in some sense, the trade is still mutually beneficial for both countries and for businesses in both countries.
Can we come back to the second graph and see that still shrinking role of Russian markets for Ukraine? Where does Ukrainian business go if it's not going to Russia? What are the alternative markets it finds?
It looks like after Russia has imposed embargo on Ukrainian goods, Ukrainian firms started to look for some output markets, for some outer markets in Europe, for example. And it looks like, for example, Ukrainian butter became a very important critical import in Europe. It became the first or the second. Ukraine became first or second trading partner in butter for Europe, for the European Union.
You mean butter or sunflower oil?
Butter, not sun, but butter. Сливочное масло, butter. Sunflower oil finds their producers elsewhere. We are talking about new markets for what is called egg powder. I think it's just something like that. It's just pretty. They found lots of markets in Asia for the egg powder and for the powdered milk. It looks like some firms in machinery they produce some either turbines or pipes. I don't remember the exact name of that item. They have found a pretty nice market in Bangladesh, and they basically replaced Russian market with Bangladesh market. Again, now we are talking about those stories which are kind of individual, but the latest research we ran with my student in Kyiv School of Economics this spring have found that the most productive firms turned out to be they can easier get to the outer markets and to replace Russia with somebody else. Moreover, it looks like those most productive firms they can easier diversify. They can find more trade partners. So if firms which trade with Russia has approximately 3 to 4 trade partners on average, more productive firms that trade with somebody else have more trading partners, like 7 or 8 on average.
Does this mean maybe a provocative idea that Russian war and Russian trade war has it had a positive impact on Ukrainian economy because it helped it to diversify?
The overall impact is still probably negative, so I think it would be too naive and maybe too brave to talk about the positive impact of the war. However, for some companies, the war has become this impulse. They gave this impulse to find the trade partners outside, and they found out that the world is much bigger than Russia itself. So they have found trade partners outside. But this is it drives competition within Ukraine, it drives their productivity, it boosts their productivity because only most productive firms can find outer markets easier. So in some sense, this war might become either the grave or the good future for some companies, depending upon whether they are more productive or not.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. We had Volodymyr Vakhitov, Ukrainian economist. We talked about how Ukraine is reacting to the Russian trade war and how still trade continues between Russia and Ukraine despite the war, and why, what are the reasons for this. Stay on Hromadske.